Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host George Bogdan. Our guest today is David Ignatius, the associate editor and foreign affairs columnist for The Washington Post. For decades, David has been one of America's most deeply sourced analysts on global intelligence, espionage, and national security. He's also the best-selling author of 12 acclaimed espionage thrillers, which is widely considered one of the most realistic depictions of spycraft ever written. David is also a frequent analyst on Morning Joe. David Ignatius, welcome to Clearer Than Truth.
Good afternoon to you.
We were talking on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and you had to interview the folks who were doing the Iran deal. Is any Iran deal going to stick? Let's start there. When will this war end?
So I think this war is going to have a long tail. As it started, I wrote that we may never have a final conclusion. We'll have a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. I think that is coming. It's in Iran's interest to do that, and Iran wants to be paid for it, and probably will be. But unfortunately, in terms of the certainty that Iran won't have a nuclear program, I don't see that materializing yet. In terms of the other ways that Iran threatens the region, it's been set back. Its proxies have been weakened, but it's still a destabilizing presence. And to me, most disturbing of all, this regime, which has been, I think, upsetting stability and order in the Middle East since I began covering it in 1980, it is more hardline than ever. Unfortunately, the survivors of the strike at Iran's leadership, who are now running the country, have learned that defying the United States and Israel works. They've crossed all the red lines that used to be deterrents to their action. For years, they didn't dare to close the Strait of Hormuz, but they've done it, and it worked. And there's no guarantee that the next time they have an issue, they won't do it again.
Fascinating. I wonder whether you think there might be sort of unintended consequences for other great powers elsewhere that sort of we're underemphasizing right now, because there's a kind of fixation on the two parties that are most thoroughly kind of in conflict. Do you think that those are worth evaluating, or is that all hand waving? Or
no, I think this is going to be a new order in the Middle East. It's hard to know exactly what the characteristics will be, but I'll note some things that are already clear. There's new distance between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I don't think that's going to be resolved anytime soon. Turkey has taken a bigger regional role, with Saudi Arabia, which historically was wary of Turkey, becoming a close ally. Pakistan, with its nuclear weapons, has been drawn into the region as a protector of Saudi Arabia. Israel's status in the region, which I was a big supporter of the Abraham Accords, and I've hoped that that sense of normalization of one Middle East would increase. I think it's really slowed or stopped unless the Israelis make some significant changes on the Palestinian issue. So, unfortunately, I think this is a war that really has left just about everybody worse off, except the hardest of the hardliners in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are now in charge in Iran.
Right. I was fascinated to watch that I think panel that you chaired all those years ago in Switzerland, in which Erdogan arguably was at the apex of his initial kind of attempt to control, the Middle East. And I had long been a skeptic, having lived in Turkey, of the AKP and the people I call apologists, saying that he was totally, benign and all these things. And I think you brought to the surface his incredible hostility towards Israel and Shimon Peres, and I just wonder now that Turkey has positioned itself yet again to be this would be regional competitor for hegemony with Iran. Are we going to have another moment where the mirror breaks again? I don't know, but it's interesting how these things cycle.
Well, Erdogan is a willful, determined, implacable political force. That moment on the stage in Davos in 2009, I think it was a long time ago, but that was an early sign that he was prepared to be a defiant presence. He walked off the stage. I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that. Went home to roaring cheers, a huge crowd celebrating his act of defiance. He is in some ways Israel's enduring regional problem. Iran has been significantly set back as a military power, and Turkey increasingly is a question mark for Israel. So in all the ways that we've discussed, it's a different Middle East. I should add one more thing, which is that the Chinese have just kind of sat on the sidelines as this whole drama has unfolded. They haven't done anything really to support Iran, but they haven't done anything to check Iran and help us, help the United States, reopen the strait. And I've been struck by that. The Chinese talk about wanting a bigger place in some sort of new world order, but they aren't doing anything to demonstrate that they're really prepared to step up. This is a moment when their interests are as affected as anyone's, but they've been basically silent. It's interesting. It's like a sort of non-moment for the China that we keep thinking is a new superpower.
I want to come back to China in a minute, but I have a two-part question that will seem a little bit reductive, and so I apologize. But one, what should the U.S. have in mind for a goal for the Middle East? What do we want to get out of it? At no point in the last 25 years has any intervention been successful. And if anything, we've just strained our economy and lost people and continued to trade alliances between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, kind of Turkey for 2 minutes. What should our overarching policy towards the Middle East be? And what should our objective and what we want to achieve be? And then I'll get to the second part later.
So, as someone who, as I said earlier, has been covering the Middle East on and off now since 1980, 46 years, I just have the sense of the same recurring dramas. I'm so sick of these issues paralyzing the region and the United States. I wrote the other day that, quoting a Lebanese journalist, that Lebanon, but you could argue this Middle East as a whole, is the graveyard of grand projects. The big ideas that we've had for stabilizing the region typically haven't produced anything. I was a supporter of President Trump's plan to end the Gaza war, not simply the ceasefire, but I thought that his plan for governance in Gaza was sensible. The people he put in charge, I talked to, one of them I know well, and I was full of hope that might really be a path to gradual disarmament of Hamas and the stabilization of and reconstruction of that little part of the Middle East. So far, nothing has happened. And I would estimate at least 80% of the Palestinian people in Gaza remain effectively under the political control of Hamas. And how can that be, that there was a war for 2 years, enormous loss of life, and Hamas is still running the show for 80% of the Palestinians? I could just, my head spins. So, how should we think about the future? Obviously, our interests begin with stability. We have an interest in Israel's ability to exist safely and securely. We have similar interests with other allies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think I'd sum it up. Whenever I ask people in the Middle East or other parts of the world, what is it? What do you want? And people will often answer, we want normal life. Meaning we don't want to live with this turmoil, with people ripping us off, klepto governments and autocratic leaders. We want normal life. And to the extent the United States can support that without military intervention, which we have demonstrated, yet again, doesn't really work very well in producing political results. I'm for it. I like that part of the world. I want people to have that normal life that they dream of.
I guess my second part of that question is, what is the world? We're not a hegemon. It's not 1990. It's not a bipolar world. How would you describe the current alliances and global powers? Like what does this look the most similar to historically, and what is the world today under a political system?
So I'm somebody who was a sometimes tireless or tedious advocate of the old order, the alliances and partnerships the U.S. developed around the world. I think they brought stability. I think when we made mistakes, as we often did, they buffered those mistakes. I think the partnerships were good for other countries, but they were good for us too. So the way in which this administration has pretty systematically weakened them in Asia and Europe, I think is a loss for our security and in the long run for our economic prosperity. So I regret that. What was the other part of your question, Nathan? Forgive me.
Yeah. How would someone describe where we are in history? What is the current political environment where it's not so crystal clear as US versus Russia or China, US, Russia, or China, US? Who are the drivers? Who will be the drivers?
So we're one order is decaying. The order the United States built in the last months of the Second World War, symbolized by the international institutions, the UN, the World Bank, U.S.-led but globally inclusive. World of alliances and partnerships that I mentioned. That's giving way to something different, but we don't really know what it is yet. One characteristic is that China will be a much bigger player. People often speak about a G2, two great powers that matter, the U.S. and China. President Trump behaved during his visit to Beijing as if he might be in sympathy with that. He very much wants a good relationship with China. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think the task of any good American leader is to find ways to avoid a really catastrophic collision with the rising China. My feeling is, history tells us the best way to do that is to keep your defenses strong and deter adversaries so they can't get it on the cheap. But another part of it is talking to them, and I think President Trump went to China in a way that Chinese read as sympathetic, accepting, cooperative, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There is a danger that China's ambitions will reach to a kind of global domination like what the United States had after 1945. If that happens, that will threaten us and all of our friends. I just have come back from Thailand. I spent last weekend there, and I found Thais, but also people from across Southeast Asia, really worried about a retreating United States and being left really at the mercy of this rising China, whose intentions aren't clear. If you're a Thai, if you're a Vietnamese, if you're Malaysian, you don't really know what China's up to or where it wants to go.
I want to hand it to George, but briefly, and again, this is simplistic, but why does it matter for Americans? I think most people, like the abstract threat of a rising China, it doesn't register. Like their life probably won't change in their lifetime. Their kids' lives doesn't seem like it's going to change. And frankly, for most Americans, it's not like life is exceptional like the 90s when people can't afford basic healthcare and to buy bananas from the store. So who cares, frankly, if China is the other superpower and we do retreat?
So, in the abstract, there's going to be China is a great power. And we never really faced anything like China. China is our technology equal. We have extraordinary skills. So do the Chinese. In some technologies, many technologies, they're ahead of the United States. So you have to think about what that world would look like, where all the implements of this increasingly modern, accelerating techno life that we live are Chinese control. TikTok was an example of that. This universal communications tool. Do you really want that in the hands of another country? I don't mean to be a scaremonger about China, and the why should we worry about this question is a fair one to ask. Everything tells me that a world where China just dominates, and let's just put it economically. Let's not imagine Chinese troops off our shores. China already is the dominant manufacturing power in the world. Pretty soon, the Chinese are going to be the only country really making electric vehicles successfully. They're going to blow out the European manufacturers. That's already happening. In Thailand, everywhere you go, you see huge billboards for Chinese electric vehicles. And soon they'll be, everywhere in Asia. And I think they're going to capture the European market too. So you have to think, what would it be like to live in a world where the Chinese basically manufactured everything that we use? Because we're kind of getting close to that. That's why I'm in some sympathy with President Trump's efforts to rebalance that. I think we do need to reshore manufacturing. I thought the CHIPS Act during the Biden administration, but supported by a lot of Republicans, was really a good idea. We need to make things here. I think the new, stepping into new robotic manufacturing in the United States to compete with China, I'm all for that. So I think that'd be my point. You just have to kind of play the thought experiment. Well, what would it be like if China had unchallenged dominance in technology and manufacturing? What would it be like to live in that world? And I think most people would say, I wouldn't be entirely comfortable with that.
Yeah, I completely agree with your view on that. And, as a child of the Pacific, I grew up visiting some of these places that, China subjected to what I saw as a much more heavy-handed imperialism than that which the United States is routinely, accused of. I don't look at the United States as an empire, but there are places like the CNMI, the Northern Marianas Islands, where it was essentially an economic colony of China for the purposes of affixing labels that said made in America. And once the tax loophole was gone, they essentially just left and treated it as a place to buy and sell human organs and to trade, children. Right? I mean, it was terrifying how this small island atoll faced this kind of economic collapse, in part because these CCP backed entities could not derive economic value. So, I mean, that's been really part of my frame of reference for a long time. But I just want to mention, that tension between upsetting our classical allies and at the same time addressing this kind of economic crisis, to me, as someone who's been involved in trade law for a few years now, I'm sort of stunned by, on the one hand, some of our allies and friends who want to be kind of receptacles or trans-shipping points for Chinese goods. And at the same time, want to profess their preference that control the global economy. These things seem to be in tension with each other because, on the one hand, Chinese control of these supply chains, is incompatible with the United States kind of supporting a global trading system. So, do you see that as a tension? I mean, are there countries in Southeast Asia that we think we have to have this tough conversation with? You got to change the way that you're operating to remain our ally, or how do you manage that?
It's a great question. So I think that the way in which tariffs were applied by President Trump, the kind of erratic stop-start nature of trade policy, left our economic partners in Asia. We do a lot of trade with the ASEAN countries and across Asia. Left them confused. They just they don't they're used to an America that's predictable in some ways. Can be they're free riders on our security guarantees, on our presence, our framing of the international trade order. They're confused now and trying to figure out how much do they have to defer to China. Countries that were kind of moving our way, even diplomatically, like Vietnam. One significant thing that I think happened during the Biden administration was a real upgrading of U.S.-Vietnam relations. Vietnam's an amazingly productive country, rising force in ASEAN, and I think that's much more precarious now. I'm a big fan of Japan as a partner for the United States in security and economic matters. Whenever we ask for something, the Japanese are there. I was told by a half dozen people when I was in Bangkok who were business or government officials that the most popular country in Southeast Asia now, amazingly, when you think back 80 years, is Japan. Japan is there. Japan is stable. Japan is reliable. Japan doesn't make big demands politically in the way that people feel they're getting from the United States. So, again, I think the miracle of American power over my lifetime is that countries followed us without coercion. We didn't. Maybe we were too generous. We didn't get paid back enough for what we were doing. But it was an order that I think was enormously beneficial to the United States. So to the extent we lose that, I worry about what's going to replace it. As Nathan said, what is this historical moment? I'm struggling to define it. I can't yet, but I worry that it may be something that we won't like.
I want to shift a little bit from the Middle East to Ukraine. The war is 4 years and like 4 months in. You wrote a piece on how Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, in your piece on how Putin and Trump handle strategic missteps, you looked at Russia's current position. Does the military stalemate indicate a structural decline for Putin, or has he successfully managed to sustain Russia's economy? How long can the war go?
So I think there are increasing strains for Putin. He is getting blowback from the Russian elite. Most recently, the head of Sberbank, which is one of the big Kremlin-supported banks in Russia, spoke out publicly and basically said it's time to end this war. And that's a sentiment you hear from other Russian oligarchs. But public opinion polls in Russia, not 100% reliable, but they certainly are directionally reliable, are showing declining support for the war, declining support for Putin. You can just see in Putin's face that he's a man under stress. This will go down. His invasion of Ukraine will go down, I think, probably with our invasion of Iraq as a sort of epic foreign policy misjudgment. This was an unnecessary war for Putin, but it was born of his obsession with the oneness of Russian and Ukrainian culture. I visited Ukraine, I guess 8 times now since the war began. I've been there twice this year. Every time I go, I'm struck first, obviously, by the bravery of Ukrainian people in resisting this invasion. But I'm struck by their innovation, their creativity. It's still a very corrupt country. Nobody should have any illusions about that. But among the corrupt companies are these incredible tech startups making drones, making electronics for drones. They're incredibly innovative. I talked when I was there in April with some of the drone makers who'd just gotten back from the front. They just had downloaded everything from the battalions that they were working with, particularly like what jamming, what frequencies are being jammed? How do we escape that? How do we bounce signals in different ways? And they go back to their factories, they reprogram, redesign. A month later, there's a new iteration out on the battlefield. It's incredible. They will be world leaders, I think, in this technology for a while. We better be sure we're learning from them. So. I think a stalemate for Ukraine, which is what this is an incredibly bloody stalemate. 1.4 million casualties now estimated for Russia. It's imponderably large number. Very large casualties also for Ukraine, but maybe half that. Stalemate in this war, as painful as it is for Ukraine, I think is a kind of victory. And at some point, you begin to sense Putin's ability to wage this war will crack. I think we're getting toward that point. I probably can get through this year. But the idea that an indefinite war like this, I think Russians won't accept. And there's no sign I see that Ukraine either is ready to capitulate or can be forced to capitulate.
Is there a world where Russia can achieve its objectives within the next year?
So, Donald Trump decided to rescue Vladimir Putin and impose significant new constraints on Ukraine. For example, cut off the flow of U.S. intelligence, even though we're not directly supplying weapons anymore. We do supply intelligence that's essential for Ukraine's defense. If he forbade American companies like Starlink from providing services to Ukraine, Ukraine couldn't communicate with its forward units. They depend absolutely on Starlink. So there are ways that Trump could try to deliver a settlement in the interests of Putin. I would find that shocking. Just flat out shocking if he did that. But other than that, Russia last night began a level of intense bombing of Kyiv that I think is beyond anything they've done, and they can continue that. Building ballistic missiles, and Ukraine can't stop them. Doesn't have enough Patriot missiles to stop them. So that's another way this could be driven to an end.
As a kind of like final, kind of question, I think it's interesting to reflect on what the effect of this stalemate, the effect of this Russian strategic failure might have, in part because, Putin as this kind of infinitely evil character who everyone can kind of, ascribe all of these negative outcomes. I think, we can all agree on this, but were Putin not to be in power, I mean, is Ukraine what changes Russia sort of from being France, during the Algerian war? Like, does it get the regime to kind of see that this, sense of itself as an empire is not manageable? Or, is that an inbuilt feature to Russia, which simply, is impossible to get rid of, given, how folks at the top of that country are just always going to view it? I mean, I don't know. It's tough to think about that, but I wonder if we'll see an outcome that's.
So I think people should be careful and think about the future welfare and stability of Russia, even as they try to support Ukraine's resistance to this invasion. What comes after Putin may well be worse. I mean, a sort of fragmented Russia with warlords and oligarchs and nuclear weapons under much less certain control, a Russian military that's battered, has demoralized, defeated in this conflict, the Russian army of prisoners, angry Dagestanis and Chechens, kind of turned into killers roaming the streets back home. I mean, that's a Russian nightmare. And I think Americans, I think a lot of Ukrainians would say, "Great, let the place break up." I'm not in sympathy with that. I think we need to think about producing a stable Russia. And just a last thought on Russia. Sometimes you look at the Russian flag, and if you look at you see an eagle facing in two directions. And I think that Russian analysts have always said, well, that's what the country is. It looks east and west. It's never fully been able to decide whether it's an Asian country or a country, yearning to be more European. That was the story of Peter the Great, story through Russian history. And it has been in this war. A lot of people thought that a Ukraine moving west, as Ukraine did at the Maidan in 2014, would bring Russia with it. There was a yearning in Russia, certainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, to be fully a country of the West, with the West. And that's what Putin stopped. He's looking east. But you know what? To the east is the superpower. I mean, Russia's on the way to being, I don't want to say a vassal state, but a state that's subordinate to the dominant China. So these things are all up in the air. Often Zelensky will say, sure, wish somebody from this administration, Vice President Vance or even President Trump would visit us and take a look at our situation. I wish that too, because I think there's so much at stake in this war, not simply in terms of the stability of Ukraine, but as I said, in terms of what kind of future Russia has.
A final sort of good place to wrap here. You talked about how people want a normal life. It takes stability to have a normal life. If you and I and George are sitting here in 5 years in 2031, do you think that there is a world where we have fewer conflicts in Russia, in the Middle East? We have regional partners who we can trust and not trade back and forth? And can the world get to a point of stability so folks can live that normal life in a relatively near time frame?
That's a great question. On my trip to Thailand, I was struck by the discussion of global geopolitical issues being portraying a world of chaos, wars and instability and conflict. But above, it's like a superhighway that's riding over this sort of turmoil and disordered world. It is a superhighway that's going to have autonomous vehicles and just every magnificent achievement of technology and free flowing capital markets, and it's so somehow those two worlds are going to have to get integrated better. The idea of permanently having disordered political order and a stable technology economic order, I just don't think that can last. So, when we're sitting here in 2031, maybe AI will have convinced us to, maybe the intelligent machines will do what the intelligent human beings haven't been able to do and kind of rationalize all the little friction points that cause us trouble. That sounds, Panglossian, but maybe. Other than that, if this two-level world of disorder and order, I think it's a recipe for eventual disaster.
Okay. Well, on that note, David Ignatius, thank you for joining Clearer Than Truth. Where can our listeners continue to follow your work?
So I hope they'll come to the Washington Post, where I remain a columnist, and I hope they'll tune into podcasts like yours, where I'll try to answer good questions like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.